Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you happen to be watching this. I hope you're having a great day. Today we're going to start with the cold dish. We're asking two questions. Question number one, what is this thing? Question number two, why should we care? And we will begin with the second question, and then we will move on to discuss options to try to define, try to describe, try to analyze the novel The Cold Dish. As always, all borrowed images and quoted text are used for educational purposes. I'm not trying to monetize this video. I'm not trying to do anything to make a buck off of it. All I'm trying to do is have my students look at material for times when they're not in class. The why bother question, why should we care, begins with the idea that students at Mount Marty should develop the ability to read critically, to reason, and to write critical, persuasive prose. Back in the day when I went to teacher school, Bloom's taxonomy was one of the big things we were told. That the remember is the easiest thing to do, create is the goal that everyone should have, and in between we should climb the ladder from remembering to understanding to applying to analyzing and evaluating. Analyzing, at its simplest, I think, is to break down into its essential features, to take something complex and break it down into its parts. Critical thinking includes conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and/or evaluating. All of those things were on Bloom's taxonomy on that previous slide. So we're going to start with the analysis, and then we will keep working into the evaluation element as well. Another element is the idea that critical reading also involves analyzing and evaluating. So if critical thinking is analyzing and evaluating, critical reading asks you to do the same thing. And I think it's important to understand that we're going to do that with fiction and nonfiction. And we're going to take a look at the idea that critical reading should go beyond what the text says or the novel's plot, but appreciate the perspective and try to understand the facts and what all of the facts lead up to. And I think, again, it's important just to understand that critical reading, critical writing are linked. If the purpose of this class is critical writing, critical reading, breaking things down into its constituent parts, is linked to critical writing. And finally, a book is a machine to think with, and a writer's thoughts can be improved when externalized on the paper or some other medium. The more we write, the better we think. So let's get back to the book. What the heck is this novel? And as we go through it, I want to go beyond the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly. With all due respect to Clint Eastwood and Nick Shabazz, Clint Eastwood starred in the movie The Good, the Great, the Bad, and the Ugly. Nick Shabazz is a nice reviewer who talks about good, great, bad, and ugly. Sorry, Clint. Sorry, Nick. We're going to have to go beyond that. And we're going to go beyond that by looking at what this novel might be. We're going to begin by looking at what's called the traditional detective formula. In the traditional detective formula, the purpose of the story is to have the reader solve the puzzle. There's been a murder, there's been some sort of heinous crime, and the reader is invited to go along with the detective and to try to solve the puzzle before the detective solves the puzzle. It was a seemingly perfect crime. All right. The murder happened in a room that was locked from the inside. There was no way in, there was no way out. How can we make this? How can we figure out who did it when we can't even figure out how it was done? We need both. The clues are presented early. Many of the clues are going to be misreading. Hence, it's a puzzle. You have to figure out how all of the pieces go together, but the author or the narrator cannot lie to us. And it's important here to understand that the detective will not lie, even though the detective is usually not the narrator. There are exceptions, but usually in a traditional detective novel, the detective is not the narrator. Looking at the characters in a traditional detective novel, the detective usually is smarter than everyone else and sees things that other people don't. Usually, the detective will have some unusual features, some unusual physical habits. Sherlock Holmes will break things down into how many bowls of pipe tobacco he should smoke. To solve this, he will play the violin for hours. He's all sorts of weird ideas about how life should be. Also, Holmes has the tall and thin, extremely tall and thin, that huge beak nose. That's all part of describing the character as well. And the narrator, who's not going to lie to us, often will serve as the detective's sidekick. And the narrator often is of the belief that the detective's fecal matter has no odor. The setting and plot are also key parts of this traditional formula. It's going to be a rural setting. The victim might be someone that people hate. It's going to be upper class folks in the rural setting in a big fancy house with a few butlers and chambermaids and all that sort of stuff running around to help folks. The police are not going to be very good. And there's going to be false arrests, and the detective is going to have to explain to them that they have the wrong person. And at the very end, the detective is going to gather everybody together and explain how the crime was solved. Next is the hard boiled detective formula. I apologize for the cheap joke with the eggs. The focus here is not the puzzle. The focus here is the character, especially the detective. Usually, there's some woman involved or some. The detective is traditionally male, so there's some woman involved. And usually, there's going to be some sort of relationship during the course of the novel or the course of the movie. And so you have to figure out how the woman plays into the detective's solving of the crime. And usually there are a few other sidekicks who help out a little bit. But the focus is on who are these people, not on the puzzle of the crime. The emotions are low level, they're almost flat. Everybody seems a touch depressed. And that's because most of the people we encounter, most of the institutions we encounter in these novels are going to be corrupt. Even the detective may not be a good guy. In fact, on the next slide, we'll see that the detectives are often amoral. And instead of a rural setting where the rainwater can wash everything clean, this is going to be an urban setting. Nothing's going to seem clean. It's going to be very, very grimy. This detective can be a professional. He can get paid. The traditional detective is often an amateur who just happens to be good at sleuthing. This detective can get paid for his work. As I said earlier, the detective is often amoral. Not immoral, but he's going to be amoral. And his view of morality, such as it is going to be determined by his code. He's going to say that he should act in a certain way because of his personal code, not the law, not the code that most quote unquote moral people would have, but his code. Detective is often a smart ass, and part of that will get him into trouble where he might get punched, but he's not adverse to punching back. It's much more violent, much more gritty, as I said, than the traditional detective novel. Next is the police procedural. It's going to have official investigations. It's going to deal with cops. They're going to have to solve multiple crimes simultaneously. Usually, the hard boiled detective is working with one. Usually, the traditional detective is working with one. Cops are going to be working with three, four, six. We're not going to focus on the corrupt person, or we're not going to focus on the detective and how the detective sees things that no one else sees. There's going to be forensics. There's going to be autopsies. They're going to gather the evidence and put them in little plastic bags. And they're going to be search warrants, and they're going to interrogate suspects. It's going to be long hours, cold coffee, lots of paperwork, administrators who may be bumbling and not know what they're doing. And they're going to work hard. They're going to do everything right. And it still might boil down to luck. And as I said earlier, it's going to deal with a cop. And these cops are going to focus on irony and sick humor because of all the drudgery and all the paperwork. It's all they can do to get through it. Last, I want to talk about the Western. The Western has a lot of bad guys, criminals, outlaws, has a lot of sheriffs. So some elements might be the same as some of the detective stories. It's also going to have ranches and saloons and shootouts. Many times, because it's set in the west of the 1800s, there might be conflict between Native Americans and the white people who are coming into the territory, into the region. All of this sort of stuff is a key element to the Western. Also, the idea of wilderness and big landscapes as opposed to a rural town or a large city. Again, it's going to be the frontier of the American West. There may be some references to the American Civil War. The hero is going to be a lone figure, even though I've got three people here. It's one family, a father and his two sons on a ranch out in the middle of Nevada. But they're going to look at courage and honor and resilience and all of the things that are supposed to be, again, a code almost. And I would point out that their view of courage and honor and resilience and their code in some ways might be similar to the hard-boiled detective's code. There's going to be good and evil. The protagonist might be confronting several adversaries at the same time. So, like the police procedural, there's a lot of things going on that the cowboy, the sheriff, whoever it is going to have to deal with. Further, there's going to be morality. We're going to talk about justice, redemption. Sometimes it's going to be about revenge. All of these subjects, and I'm going to use the term subject other than themes as I cut and paste this, I think it's important to understand that, again, those might be part of motives in a police procedural. Those might be elements of a hard boiled detective story as well. And they feature prominently in the Western. Rugged, gritty, and adventurous. Gritty, I think, is important because it's distinguished from grimy. The atmosphere in a traditional story is perhaps none of these. The atmosphere in a police procedural can be sort of gritty and rugged. I don't know about adventurous. Again, the adventurous might not be an element of the traditional, but certainly a certain ruggedness, but it's going to be beyond gritty. It's going to be grimy. So we're going to take a look at these are going to be dark, but they're not going to be as dark as the traditional. Or excuse me, not going to be as dark as the hard-boiled detective. Finally, what is the cold dish? Is it a police procedural? Is it a hard-boiled detective novel featuring a cop in Wyoming? or is it a Western set in the 21st century? That's one of the things we need to be looking at as we get ready to go through and analyze this novel and think about what's happening in this novel. I think I'll wrap it up here. I hope everyone has a good day. Hope to see you in class the next class period.